Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the shadows of history. Tonight we invite you to settle back, perhaps pull a soft blanket closer, and allow your mind to drift into a world 7,000 years removed from your comfortable present. You are safe here, wrapped in the certainty of modern law and abundant food, as we explore a time when hunger was a constant companion and survival demanded choices that would horrify us today. Tonight, we travel to 5000 BC, to the dawn of civilization itself, when humanity first began to gather in permanent settlements and the concept of mine and yours took on meanings that could determine life or death. In this ancient world, where the line between survival and starvation was measured in handfuls of grain, we will discover what befell those desperate enough to steal food from their neighbors. Imagine yourself drifting back through the millennia, past the rise and fall of empires, past the invention of writing, past the building of the first cities, to a time when the greatest human achievement was convincing wild wheat to grow where we wanted it to. Here, in this distant dawn, we will witness the birth of justice itself, primitive and harsh, yet strangely familiar in its attempt to balance the scales of human survival. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a comment below as we begin this journey into humanity's earliest struggles with morality, survival, and the delicate balance between compassion and consequence. Let the rhythm of ancient life wash over you as we explore what it truly meant to transgress against your community when tomorrow's meal was never guaranteed. The morning sun rises over a landscape that would seem both familiar and utterly alien to your modern eyes. Picture yourself standing on a gentle hill overlooking one of humanity's first permanent settlements, a cluster of perhaps 50 mud brick dwellings nestled beside a life-giving stream. The air carries the scent of wood smoke and baking bread, mixed with the earthier aromas of livestock and the ever-present dust of a world without paved roads. This is Çatalhöyük, or perhaps one of its countless sister settlements scattered across the fertile crescents of ancient Anatolia and Mesopotamia. The rhythm of life here beats with a steady, unchanging pulse that has governed human existence for countless generations. As the first light touches the horizon, you can hear the gentle sounds of awakening, the soft lowing of cattle, the rustle of grain being poured from storage jars, the quiet murmur of voices planning the day's essential tasks. There are no church bells here, no mechanical alarms, only the natural cadence of sunrise and the biological imperatives that drive every waking moment. Imagine yourself as one of these early settlers, your hands already rough from years of grinding grain and shaping clay. Your dwelling is modest but ingenious, thick walls that keep the interior cool during the scorching summer days and warm during the bitter winter nights. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth, smooth from generations of footsteps, and the air inside carries the comforting sense of stored barley and the subtle sweetness of dried fruits hanging in carefully woven baskets. Your world extends only as far as you can walk in a day, bounded by the practical necessities of survival and the ever-present awareness that danger lurks beyond the familiar boundaries of your settlement. The storage rooms that line your dwelling tell the story of humanity's greatest revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. Here, in carefully crafted pottery vessels and woven baskets, lies the surplus that allows your community to exist. Wheat, barley, lentils, and peas, these humble grains represent security, the buffer between your family and starvation. Each jar contains not just food, but the concentrated labor of entire seasons, the careful tending of fields, the back-breaking work of harvest, the meticulous preparation and storage that transforms wild seeds into civilization itself. But with this revolutionary abundance comes a new and troubling concept: ownership. For the first time in human history, individuals can point to specific objects and say, This is mine. The grain in your storage vessels belongs to you, earned through your labor, protected by your vigilance. This seemingly simple idea carries within it the seeds of all human conflict. For if something can be owned, it can also be stolen. The very surplus that allows your community to flourish also creates the possibility of theft. And with theft comes the need for justice. You wake each morning acutely aware of the delicate balance that governs your existence. The previous year's harvest must last until the next, carefully rationed to ensure survival through the lean months. Every handful of grain is precious, every meal a small victory against the ever-present specter of hunger. Your days are consumed with the endless tasks of survival, tending crops, maintaining tools, preparing food, caring for animals, and always watching the skies for signs of the weather that could make the difference between abundance and famine. The social fabric of your community is woven tight by necessity and mutual dependence. Your neighbors are not merely people you know, they are your insurance against disaster, your partners in survival, your witnesses and judges. When the spring floods threaten to wash away your carefully tended fields, it is their hands that help you build protective barriers. When wild animals menace your livestock, it is their vigilance that supplements your own. And when the harvest comes, it is their labor that helps bring in the grain that will sustain you through the dark months ahead. Yet this interdependence creates its own tensions. In a world where resources are finite and survival is never guaranteed, the line between cooperation and competition becomes blurred. Your neighbor's success does not necessarily diminish your own, but their failure could endanger the entire community. The balance is delicate, maintained through custom, tradition, and the shared understanding that individual survival depends on collective well-being.
While you recognize ownership of tools, stored food, and personal possessions, the boundaries are fluid and context-dependent. The fields belong to those who work them, but in times of crisis, the community's need may override individual claims. The water from the stream sustains all, yet the vessels used to carry it belong to their makers. These subtle distinctions, negotiated daily through interaction and tradition, form the foundation of all future legal systems. As you move through your daily routines, you are constantly aware of the eyes of your community upon you. Privacy, as we understand it, simply does not exist. Your dwelling may be yours, but its entrance faces the communal courtyard where all can see who comes and goes. Your actions, your words, your successes and failures are known to all, recorded not in written documents, but in the collective memory of a society that must trust its members to survive. This transparency creates a powerful force for social cohesion, but also a terrible vulnerability for those who transgress against the community's expectations. The storage of food, that fundamental achievement that makes settled life possible, also creates the first opportunities for what we would recognize as crime. In your mud brick dwelling, surrounded by your carefully hoarded supplies, you become both guardian and potential target. The grain that represents your family's survival is visible to all who enter your home, creating temptation for those whose own supplies may be running low. The very act of storage, while necessary for survival, advertises wealth and creates disparity within the community. The rhythm of your days follow patterns that would remain unchanged for millennia. The careful cultivation of crops, the patient tending of animals, the endless round of food preparation and tool maintenance that keeps the fragile machinery of civilization functioning. Yet beneath this surface stability lies a constant awareness of how quickly things could change, how a failed harvest or a successful raid could transform plenty into scarcity, security into desperation, neighbor into enemy. As the seasons turn in this ancient world, you begin to understand the profound vulnerability that underlies every aspect of settled life. The abundance that agriculture promises comes with a terrible cost, complete dependence on forces beyond human control. Unlike your nomadic ancestors, who could move when resources became scarce, you and your community have tied your fate to this specific patch of earth, to the whims of weather and the fertility of soil that may betray you without warning. Imagine yourself in the depths of winter, when the stores that seemed so abundant at harvest time begin to show their limitations. The great pottery jars that once bulged with grain now reveal their bottoms with each careful measure. The dried meat that hung in aromatic strips from your rafters has dwindled to precious remnants, carefully portioned to stretch through the remaining cold months. In these lean times, you begin to understand why your ancestors spoke of the storage rooms with such reverence, why the community gatherings always included careful discussions of rationing and resource management. The social dynamics of your settlement shift subtly but perceptibly as winter deepens.
Families who were generous with their surplus during the abundant harvest months begin to guard the remaining stores more carefully. The easy sharing that characterized the early months after harvest gives way to careful calculation, each household assessing the remaining supplies against the weeks that stretch ahead before spring planting can begin again. You notice how conversations that once flowed freely now carry undercurrents of anxiety, how glances linger on neighbors' storage areas, how the natural human impulse toward generosity battles against the primal fear of starvation. In this world without a writing, without formal record keeping, the community's memory serves as both archive and court of law. Every transaction, every favor, every obligation is held in the collective consciousness of your neighbors. When Ketu borrowed 3 measures of barley during the difficult month before harvest, the entire community witnessed and remembered. When Asha shared her surplus of dried peas with a family struck by illness, that act of generosity became part of the social fabric, creating bonds and obligations that extend far beyond the immediate exchange of goods. But memory, you discover, can be as fragile as the crops themselves. As hunger begins to gnaw at the edges of consciousness, as the careful rationing forces families to eat smaller portions each day, the clear lines of obligation and reciprocity begin to blur. Did Ketu really borrow 3 measures, or was it 4? Was Ash's generosity freely given, or was it part of a larger pattern of exchange that created expectations of repayment? In a world where survival depends on these invisible networks of mutual support, such questions take on life and death significance. The architecture of your settlement tells the story of this delicate balance between cooperation and self-preservation. The storage rooms, those repositories of life itself, are positioned deep within each dwelling, protected not only from the elements, but from the curious eyes and desperate hands of neighbors. Yet the very design of your community, with its interconnected courtyards and shared spaces, makes true secrecy impossible. Everyone knows who has plenty and who has little, who has managed the resources well, and who faces the specter of empty stores before spring arrives. As you move through the narrow pathways between dwellings, you become acutely aware of the subtle signs of plenty and scarcity that surround you. The family whose cooking fire burns bright with dried dung fuel clearly has sufficient livestock to spare such resources. The household where children no longer run and play with their usual energy shows the telltale signs of reduced rations. The dwelling where the storage jars stand slightly ajar, displaying their contents, signals abundance and perhaps an invitation to trade. The home where such vessels are kept carefully sealed suggests a family counting every grain against the approaching spring. The tools of survival, those essential implements that mean the difference between success and failure in this harsh world, become objects of intense focus during the lean months. Your grinding stones, worn smooth by generations of use, represent not just convenience, but the ability to transform hard grain into digestible food. The sharp flint blades that allow you to process meat and plants efficiently become precious beyond measure.
Even something as simple as a well-made basket, capable of carrying and storing the resources that sustain life, takes on almost sacred significance. Yet, it is in the preparation and consumption of food that the true tensions of your community become most visible. The daily ritual of grinding grain, performed in the communal courtyards where all can see, becomes a subtle display of household resources. The amount of grain being processed, the frequency of grinding, the quality of the barley or wheat, all of these details are noted and remembered by neighbors who are making their own careful calculations about survival. The evening meals, once communal affairs that reinforced social bonds, begin to retreat into the privacy of individual dwellings as resources grow scarce. Families who once shared cooking fires and ingredients now prepare their modest portions separately, not from selfishness, but from the practical necessity of controlling precisely what goes into their bodies and their children's stomachs. The aromatic smoke that once announced communal feasting now carries the thinner, more desperate sense of carefully rationed meals stretched to feed hungry families. The children of your community, those bright-eyed witnesses to humanity's first experiments with settled life, provide the most heartbreaking testimony to these changing circumstances. Their games, once elaborate and energetic, become quieter, more subdued. Their growing bodies, demanding nutrition for proper development, begin to show the subtle but unmistakable signs of inadequate diet. The slightly hollow cheeks, the less lustrous hair, the tendency to tire more easily during play.
Yet even in their diminished state, they remain the community's most precious resource, the living proof that this great experiment in settlement and agriculture will continue into the next generation. The seasonal cycles that govern your existence take on new meaning as scarcity deepens. The winter solstice, that turning point when the days begin to lengthen again, becomes not just an astronomical event, but a psychological milestone, proof that spring will indeed return, that the time of planting and renewal approaches. Yet even as the days grow incrementally longer, the reality of remaining stores forces difficult calculations. Will the carefully hoarded grain last until the first spring plants can be gathered? Will the preserved meat and dried fruits carry the community through the final weeks before fresh food becomes available? In this environment of controlled scarcity and mutual dependence, the temptation to transgress against community norms begins to take tangible form. The clear moral boundaries that seem so absolute during times of abundance become blurred when survival itself hangs in the balance. The neighbor whose children cry from hunger at night, whose storage jars stand visibly empty, whose every gesture speaks of desperate need. What moral calculus governs their choices when faced with another family's apparent plenty? The answer to that question will determine not just individual fates, but the very future of human civilization itself.
As winter reaches its deepest point, as the cold settles into bones and the hunger settles into souls, as the community that seemed so secure in autumn now faces the ancient specter of starvation, the stage is set for the fundamental test of human nature that will define how our species learns to live together. The theft of food, that most basic of crimes, becomes not just a legal problem, but an existential challenge to the entire concept of settled life. The morning that will change everything begins like countless others before it, with the pale gray light of pre-dawn filtering through the smoke hole in your neighbor Reduc's dwelling. But this morning carries a weight that previous dawns have lacked, a tension that speaks to desperation, finally overcoming the bonds of community that have held your settlement together through generations of shared struggle. The air is sharp, with a bite of late winter cold, and the silence that hangs over the settlement speaks not of peaceful rest, but of empty bellies and worried minds, calculating how many more days the remaining stores might last. Imagine yourself witnessing this pivotal moment in human history, not as a distant observer, but as a member of this fragile community about to experience its first crisis of moral authority. A duke, once a respected member of your settlement, a skilled potter whose vessels grace many homes, has watched his family's reserves dwindle to nothing over the past weeks.
His youngest child, barely weaned, has begun to show the telltale signs of malnutrition. The distended belly, the listless eyes, the frightening stillness that comes when a small body lacks the energy for normal childhood activity. His partner, once robust and cheerful, now moves with the careful deliberation of someone conserving every precious calorie. The social fabric that once seemed so strong begins to reveal its fragile threads as Attic makes his daily rounds through the settlement, his eyes no longer meeting those of his neighbors with the easy familiarity of shared prosperity. Instead, his gaze lingers on details that would have seemed insignificant during abundant times. The slight bulge of a storage jar visible through an open doorway, the lingering aromas of cooking that suggest ingredients still available, the subtle signs of families who have managed their resources more successfully, or perhaps simply started with larger reserves. The psychology of desperation unfolds slowly, like a flower opening to reveal something beautiful and terrible at its heart. Attic's morning walks, once social encounters that reinforced community bonds, become reconnaissance missions driven by the most primal of human needs. He notes which households still grind grain daily, which families continue to feed their cooking fires with the generosity of those who have fuel to spare, which children still play with the energy that comes from adequate nutrition. These observations, innocent in themselves, begin to form a map of opportunity in his increasingly despot mind. The moment of decision arrives not with trauma, but with the quiet desperation of a parent watching their child fade
As the settlement sleeps in the depths of night, when the only sounds are the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through mud-brick walls, a duke rises from his sleeping mat with the careful silence of someone who has rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind. The moonlight filtering through his dwelling casts everything in shades of gray that seem appropriate for the moral twilight he is about to enter. His feet know every stone and depression in the pathways between dwellings, knowledge acquired through years of legitimate movement through his community. But tonight, this familiar geography takes on new significance as he navigates toward the home of Enlil, the settlement's most successful farmer, whose storage rooms are rumored to still contain substantial reserves. The very familiarity of the route speaks to the intimate nature of this transgression. This is not a stranger stealing from strangers, but a neighbor crossing the sacred boundary that separates community cooperation from individual desperation. The dwelling that becomes the target of humanity's first recorded impulse toward theft stands as a testament to the agricultural revolution's capacity for creating both abundance and inequality. Enlil's success stems not from greed or exploitation, but from a combination of favorable circumstances, skillful farming, and perhaps most importantly, a larger family unit that provided more hands for the crucial work of planting, tending, and harvesting. His storage rooms, carved deep into the earth beneath his dwelling, represent the legitimate fruits of diligent labor and careful planning. As a duke approaches the threshold of Enlil's home, he crosses more than just a physical boundary.
The concept of private property, still new to human consciousness, takes on concrete reality in this moment of transgression. The grain that lies in carefully sealed pottery vessels within Enlil's dwelling represents not just sustenance, but the revolutionary idea that individuals can own the products of their labor, can exclude others from access to resources, can claim exclusive right to things that were once shared by all who needed them. The technical aspects of the theft itself reveal the intimate knowledge that community members possess of each other's lives and habits. A duke knows exactly where Enlil stores his grain because he has helped carry vessels during community work parties. He knows which pottery seals can be removed and replaced without obvious detection because he helped make some of them. He understands the daily routines of Enlil's household because of the close-knit nature of the settlement makes privacy nearly impossible. This theft is not the work of a skilled criminal, but of a desperate community member using legitimate knowledge for illegitimate purposes. The grain that changes hands in those dark moments before dawn represents far more than simple sustenance. Each handful that a duke carefully transfers to his own small vessel carries the weight of moral revolution, the moment when individual need overcame collective agreement, when survival instinct superseded social contract. The barley that flows from Enlil's storage jar to a duke's desperate hands embodies humanity's first confrontation with the fundamental tension between individual survival and community cohesion that will define civilization for millennia to come. Yet even in this moment of transgression, the social bonds that define humanity assert themselves.
Attic takes not all that he can carry, but only what he believes his family needs to survive the remaining weeks until foraging becomes possible. This restraint speaks to a moral calculation that transcends simple greed. Even in desperation, he recognizes that his survival depends on the community's survival, that taking too much might destroy the very social fabric that makes settled life possible. The psychological impact of this theft extends far beyond the immediate participants. As Attic returns to his dwelling with his stolen grain, he carries not just physical sustenance, but a burden of guilt and fear that will poison every future interaction with his community. The knowledge that he has violated the fundamental trust on which settlement life depends creates an isolation more profound than physical hunger. He has eaten from the fruit of civilization and found it better, transforming himself from community member to outsider through a single desperate act. The morning that follows this nocturnal transgression dawns with an innocence that belies the revolution that has occurred under cover of darkness. The settlement awakens to apparently unchanged circumstances, the same mud-brick dwellings, the same thin smoke rising from cooking fires, the same careful routines of rationing and survival that have governed life through the difficult winter months. Yet beneath this surface normalcy lies the knowledge that something fundamental has shifted, that the unspoken agreements that bind the community together have been tested and found vulnerable. The discovery of the theft, when it comes, arrives not through dramatic revelation, but through the quiet accumulation of small inconsistencies.
Enlil, checking his carefully managed stores as part of his morning routine, notices that one of his storage jars sits slightly askew, that the clay seal bears subtle finger marks that were not there before. The amount missing is small enough that he might have dismissed it as his own miscounting, but the evidence of disturbance is unmistakable to eyes that know every detail of his precious reserves. The moment when private suspicion becomes public accusation marks another milestone in humanity's developing sense of justice. Enlil faces a choice that will echo through human history, whether to handle this matter privately, perhaps approaching Aduk directly to confirm his suspicions and seek restitution, or to bring his complaint before the community as a whole. The decision he makes will help establish precedents for how human societies address violations of trust, how communities balance individual needs against collective security. The ripple effects of this simple theft spread through the settlement like cracks in drying clay. Neighbors who had maintained easy familiarity now regard each other with subtle suspicion. Storage areas that had been secured by nothing more than custom and mutual respect now require physical barriers and constant vigilance. The social trust that made settled life possible begins to harden into the formal structures of law and punishment that will characterize all future human communities. As word of the theft spreads through the settlement, carried by the same networks of communication that once shared news of successful harvests and celebrated births, the community faces its first existential crisis of moral authority.
The question is not simply what to do with Aduk, but what kind of society they want to become. Their response will establish precedents that will influence human concepts of justice, punishment, and community responsibility for thousands of years to come. The theft of food in this ancient settlement represents far more than a simple crime. It is humanity's first formal confrontation with the moral complexities that arise when individual survival conflicts with collective welfare. The grain that passed from Enlil's storage jar to Aduk's desperate hands carries within it the seeds of every legal system, every moral philosophy, every attempt to balance compassion with justice that will follow. In this moment of transgression, our species takes its first uncertain steps toward understanding what it means to live together in permanent communities, bound by invisible agreements that are both stronger and more fragile than any physical barrier. The discovery of Aduk's theft sends ripples through the settlement that extend far beyond the immediate participants, touching every aspect of how these early humans understand their relationships with one another. Imagine yourself as a witness to this pivotal moment in the development of human civilization, as a community that has never before faced such a challenge must suddenly invent the very concept of justice. The elders who gather in the central courtyard as word of the theft spreads carry with them only the wisdom of tradition and the weight of precedent that must now be created for the first time.
In settlements across the ancient world, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the highland plateaus of Anatolia, communities are simultaneously grappling with these same fundamental questions. What happens when the unspoken agreements that govern daily life are broken? How does a society balance the need for punishment with the equally pressing need to maintain community cohesion? The answers that emerge from these discussions will form the foundation of every legal system that follows. Yet they arise not from abstract philosophical consideration, but from the immediate practical necessity of survival. The figure who emerges as the voice of community judgment is not a trained lawyer or professional judge, but rather Kesh, an elderly woman whose authority derives from her long memory and her reputation for wisdom. At perhaps 60 years of age, ancient by the standards of her time, she has witnessed more seasonal cycles than almost anyone else in the settlement. Her weathered hands have ground grain through countless harvests. Her eyes have seen the settlement grow from a small cluster of dwellings to its current size, and her memory holds the accumulated knowledge of how previous disputes and difficulties have been resolved. Kesh's role as arbiter represents one of humanity's earliest experiments with formalized authority. Unlike the informal leadership that emerges during specific tasks like hunting or construction, her position carries the weight of moral judgment, the power to determine not just what happened, but what should be done about it. As she takes her place in the center of the gathered community, sitting on a simple woven mat that nonetheless marks her elevated status, she embodies the transition from purely consensual decision-making to structured systems of authority that will characterize all future human societies. The process by which the community determines Aduk's guilt reveals sophisticated understanding of evidence and testimony that challenges any assumption about the primitive nature of early human reasoning. Enlil presents his case not through emotional appeal, but through careful documentation of the evidence. The disturbed storage jar, the missing grain, the subtle signs of intrusion that speak to intimate knowledge of his household's layout. His presentation reflects an understanding that accusations require proof,
that the community's judgment depends on facts rather than suspicion. But the testimony that proves most compelling comes from an unexpected source, a Duke's own youngest child, barely old enough to speak in complete sentences, who innocently mentions the new food that appeared in their dwelling. The child's words, spoken without understanding of their significance, provide the crucial link between suspicion and certainty that the community needs to proceed with confidence. This moment illustrates how even the earliest human justice systems recognize the value of multiple forms of evidence, understanding that truth often emerges from the intersection of physical proof and personal testimony. A Duke's response to these accusations reveals the complex psychology of someone caught between desperation and guilt. Rather than denying his actions outright, he acknowledges the theft while attempting to justify it through reference to his family's dire circumstances.
His words, carefully chosen to emphasize his children's suffering while acknowledging his violation of community trust, represent one of humanity's first attempts to articulate the concept of extenuating circumstances, the idea that context matters in determining both guilt and appropriate punishment. The community's reaction to Aduk's confession illustrates the profound challenge that such transgressions pose to societies built on mutual trust. Some voices call for harsh punishment, arguing that theft threatens the very foundation of settled life and must be discouraged through severe consequences. Others advocate for understanding, pointing to Aduk's previously unblemished reputation and the genuine desperation that drove his actions. These competing perspectives represent the eternal tension between justice and mercy that will characterize human legal thinking for millennia to come. Keshe's deliberation process reveals sophisticated understanding of the multiple factors that must be considered when determining appropriate responses to transgression. She questions not only the immediate participants, but also other community members who might have knowledge of relevant circumstances. Did anyone offer assistance to Aduk's family during their time of need? Were there established protocols for seeking help that Aduk failed to follow? Could the community have prevented this situation through better resource sharing or earlier intervention? The questions that emerge from this investigation touch on fundamental issues of social responsibility that remain relevant to this day. To what extent is the community collectively responsible for the circumstances that drive individuals to desperate acts? How much obligation do those with surplus resources have to share with those in need? When does individual responsibility override collective welfare, and when does community survival require the sacrifice of individual interests? His words, carefully chosen to emphasize his children's suffering while acknowledging his violation of community trust, represent one of humanity's first attempts to articulate the concept of extenuating circumstances, the idea that context matters in determining both guilt and appropriate punishment. The community's reaction to Aduk's confession illustrates the profound challenge that such transgressions pose to societies built on mutual trust. Some voices call for harsh punishment, arguing that theft threatens the very foundation of settled life and must be discouraged through severe consequences. Others advocate for understanding, pointing to Aduk's previously unblemished reputation and the genuine desperation that drove his actions. These competing perspectives represent the eternal tension between justice and mercy that will characterize human legal thinking for millennia to come. Keshe's deliberation process reveals sophisticated understanding of the multiple factors that must be considered when determining appropriate responses to transgression. She questions not only the immediate participants, but also other community members who might have knowledge of relevant circumstances. Did anyone offer assistance to Aduk's family during their time of need? Were there established protocols for seeking help that Aduk failed to follow? Could the community have prevented this situation through better resource sharing or earlier intervention? The questions that emerge from this investigation touch on fundamental issues of social responsibility that remain relevant to this day. To what extent is the community collectively responsible for the circumstances that drive individuals to desperate acts? How much obligation do those with surplus resources have to share with those in need? When does individual responsibility override collective welfare,
And when does community survival require the sacrifice of individual interests?
Is the primary purpose of punishment to deter future crimes, to provide satisfaction to the victim, to rehabilitate the offender, or to maintain social order? These questions, which seem abstract in our modern context, carry life and death significance in a world where community survival depends on maintaining delicate balances of trust and cooperation. As the deliberations continue, patterns begin to emerge that will influence human justice systems for thousands of years. The community recognizes that different types of offenses require different types of responses, that punishment must be proportional to the harm caused, and that the circumstances surrounding a crime matter as much as the crime itself. These insights, emerging from practical necessity rather than theoretical consideration, represent humanity's first systematic attempt to codify moral behavior and establish consistent consequences for its violation. The role of precedent becomes apparent as the community grapples with questions of how their decision will affect future cases. If they show leniency to Aduk because of his desperate circumstances, will they encourage others to use similar justifications for theft? If they impose harsh punishment, will they create a society so rigid that it cannot accommodate human weakness and desperation? The weight of these considerations presses upon Kesh and her advisors as they recognize that their decision will establish patterns that will govern community life for generations to come. The process by which consensus emerges reveals sophisticated understanding of group decision-making that challenges assumptions about primitive democracy. Rather than simple majority rule, the community seeks a resolution that all members can accept even if not all are entirely satisfied. Is the primary purpose of punishment to deter future crimes, to provide satisfaction to the victim, to rehabilitate the offender, or to maintain social order? These questions, which seem abstract in our modern context, carry life and death significance in a world where community survival depends on maintaining delicate balances of trust and cooperation. As the deliberations continue, patterns begin to emerge that will influence human justice systems for thousands of years. The community recognizes that different types of offenses require different types of responses, that punishment must be proportional to the harm caused, and that the circumstances surrounding a crime matter as much as the crime itself. These insights, emerging from practical necessity rather than theoretical consideration, represent humanity's first systematic attempt to codify moral behavior and establish consistent consequences for its violation. The role of precedent becomes apparent as the community grapples with questions of how their decision will affect future cases. If they show leniency to Aduk because of his desperate circumstances, will they encourage others to use similar justifications for theft? If they impose harsh punishment, will they create a society so rigid that it cannot accommodate human weakness and desperation? The weight of these considerations presses upon Kesh and her advisors as they recognize that their decision will establish patterns that will govern community life for generations to come. The process by which consensus emerges reveals sophisticated understanding of group decision-making that challenges assumptions about primitive democracy. Rather than simple majority rule, the community seeks a resolution that all members can accept even if not all are entirely satisfied.
When young Nurgle is discovered stealing dried fish from his neighbor's storage bit, Shamash's first concern is not punishment, but restoration of balance. The concept of justice that emerges in Tel Sabi Abiad centers on the idea of restoration rather than retribution. Shamash convenes not a trial, but a negotiation, bringing together Nurgle, his victim, and their extended families to determine how the disrupted harmony of the community can be restored. The solution they reach requires Nurgle to provide labor to his victim during the coming planting season, essentially transferring his work capacity as compensation for the stolen food. This approach reflects a fundamentally different understanding of crime, not as a violation requiring punishment, but as an imbalance requiring correction. The restoration model developed in Tel Savi Abiad creates ripple effects throughout their community structure. Rather than establishing authority figures who judge and punish, they develop networks of mediators who facilitate resolution between conflicting parties. Rather than creating categories of guilt and innocence, they focus on understanding the complex web of circumstances that led to the transgression and addressing its root causes. This alternative approach to justice will echo through human history, influencing everything from indigenous legal traditions to modern restorative justice programs. Meanwhile, in the highland settlement of Chayonu in southeastern Anatolia, the response to theft takes on an entirely different character, shaped by their unique environmental challenges. Here, where the community lives in partially underground structures carved into the hillside, the theft of food is treated not just as a crime against an individual, but as an offense against the sacred order that governs their relationship with the earth itself. When Teshub is caught stealing barley from the communal granaries, the community's response involves elaborate ritual purification designed to restore both social harmony and spiritual balance. The spiritual dimension of justice in Chayonu reflects their understanding of theft as a violation that extends beyond human relationships to encompass their connection with the natural forces that sustain life. The punishment ritual requires Teshub to fast for 3 days while performing specific ceremonies designed to acknowledge his transgression and demonstrate his commitment to community values. On the 4th day, he must share a communal meal with his victim, symbolically reintegrating himself into the social fabric through the very act of eating that his theft had violated. The communal approach to both storage and punishment in Chayonu creates a fundamentally different understanding of property and individual responsibility. Because their grain is stored in common facilities managed collectively, theft is understood as a violation against the entire community rather than against a specific individual. This collective ownership model influences their approach to punishment, which emphasizes community healing and spiritual restoration, rather than individual accountability and material restitution. In the coastal settlement of Frank the Cave in what is now Greece, the community's response to food theft reflects their unique position at the intersection of land and sea resources.
When Melanthius is discovered stealing preserved fish from his neighbor's cache, the community's response draws on their deep understanding of seasonal abundance and scarcity. Rather than immediate punishment, they implement a complex system of seasonal labor exchange that allows Melanthios to repay his debt through future fishing expeditions during the abundant summer months. The temporal dimension of justice in Frank the Cave recognizes that resources and labor capacity fluctuate dramatically with the seasons, making immediate restitution often impossible, but future compensation feasible. This approach requires the community to maintain complex records of obligations and credits, developing some of humanity's earliest experiments with abstract accounting systems. The mental framework necessary to track these delayed exchanges represents a cognitive leap that will prove essential for the development of more complex economic and legal systems. The maritime influence on their justice system extends beyond practical considerations to philosophical ones. Living at the edge of the unpredictable sea, the Franklin Cave community develops an understanding of fate and circumstance that emphasizes adaptation and flexibility over rigid moral categories. The response to theft reflects this worldview, treating transgression as one of many challenges that communities must navigate together, rather than as a fundamental violation requiring severe consequences. In the fertile river valleys of early Mesopotamia, where the first true cities are beginning to emerge from collections of smaller settlements, the response to food theft becomes increasingly formalized and hierarchical. The settlement of Tel Es-Sawan, with its sophisticated irrigation systems and complex social organization, develops one of humanity's earliest examples of codified law when faced with persistent problems of grain theft from their communal storage facility.
The legal code that emerges at Tel Es-Sawan reflects their complex social hierarchy and specialized labor roles. Different punishments applied depending on the social status of both thief and victim, the type of food stolen, and the circumstances surrounding the theft. A craftsman stealing from a farmer faces different consequences than a farmer stealing from a priest, recognizing that their society has developed distinct classes with different responsibilities and privileges. This hierarchical approach to justice represents a fundamental shift from the egalitarian decision-making processes of smaller settlements toward the stratified legal systems that will characterize all future civilizations. The codification process at Tel Es-Sawan involves creating permanent records of legal precedents, some of humanity's earliest experiments with systematic lawmaking. Clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform symbols preserve not just specific punishments, but the reasoning behind them, creating a body of legal knowledge that can be consulted in future cases. This transition from oral tradition to written law represents a revolution in human thinking about justice, moving from contextual decision-making toward universal principles that can be applied consistently across time and circumstances. The enforcement mechanisms developed at Tel Es-Sawan revealed the challenges that arise when communities grow beyond the size where social pressure alone can maintain order.
They established some of humanity's first formal police functions, designating specific individuals responsible for investigating thefts and ensuring that punishments are carried out.
In the mountain valleys of early Armenia, the settlement of Arateshen develops yet another approach to food theft that reflects their harsh environment and limited resources. Here, where survival through the brutal winter months requires absolute precision in resource management, theft is treated as a form of community treason that threatens everyone's survival. When Vakram is caught stealing dried meat from his neighbor's winter cache, the community's response is swift and severe. Temporary exile during the spring months when survival outside the settlement is possible but difficult. The exile system developed in Arateshen serves multiple purposes that reflect sophisticated understanding of both punishment and social dynamics. The temporary nature of the punishment allows for eventual reintegration while ensuring that the offender experiences genuine consequences for their actions. The timing of the exile during spring, when survival is possible but challenging, provides a controlled environment for reflection and repentance without constituting a death sentence. The reintegration process in Arateshen requires the exiled individual to return with specific contributions to community welfare, new knowledge about distant resources, exotic materials for trade, or skills learned during their time away. This requirement transforms punishment into a form of service, turning the consequences of transgression into benefits for the entire community. The approach reflects an understanding that effective justice should ultimately strengthen rather than weaken social bonds. The psychological impact of temporary exile proves particularly effective in small communities where social connection is essential for both mental health and practical survival.
The isolation experienced by the exiled individual creates powerful motivation for behavioral change while allowing the community to experience both the consequences of losing a member and the relief of their eventual return. This emotional cycle reinforces community values while providing clear incentives for individual compliance with social norms. In the lake settlements of early Switzerland, where communities build their homes on stilts above the water, the response to food theft reflects their unique architectural and social circumstances. When Reto Bonatos discovered stealing preserved fish from his neighbor's underwater storage cache, the community's response involves a complex ritual of public confession and community forgiveness that takes place on the central platform where all major social activities occur. The public nature of both crime and punishment in these lake settlements reflects the impossibility of privacy in communities where all activities are visible to neighbors. The platform-based justice system requires both victim and perpetrator to present their cases before the entire community, creating a form of participatory democracy that ensures all voices are heard in determining appropriate responses to transgression. The water-based environment creates unique opportunities for symbolic punishment that reflect the community's relationship with their aquatic setting. Reto's punishment requires him to spend 3 days and nights alone on a small platform away from the main settlement, experiencing controlled isolation while remaining visible to the community. This approach allows for meaningful consequences without the extreme risk associated with land-based exile. The forgiveness ritual that concludes the punishment process in the lake settlements involves the entire community participating in a shared meal featuring contributions from every household.
This communal feast serves both to reintegrate the offender and to reinforce the social bonds that make their unique lifestyle possible. The ritual transforms individual transgression into an opportunity for community celebration and renewed commitment to shared values. As these diverse experiments in justice unfold across the ancient world, certain patterns begin to emerge that will influence human legal thinking for millennia. Communities consistently struggle to balance individual accountability with collective welfare, immediate consequences with long-term social harmony, and the need for deterrence with the desire for redemption. The solutions they develop reflect not just practical necessities, but fundamental beliefs about human nature, social responsibility, and the purposes of organized society. The resolution of Iderik's case in Kesh's settlement comes after 7 days of deliberation that will be remembered and recounted for generations to come. As the community gathers once again in their central courtyard, the weight of precedent hangs heavy in the air, for everyone present understands that their decision will establish patterns that will govern not just this case, but all future instances of transgression against community trust. The wisdom that emerges from this ancient deliberation process reveals insights about human nature and social organization that remain relevant thousands of years later. Kesh's final judgment reflects the sophisticated understanding of justice that has emerged from the community's careful consideration of all relevant factors. Rather than choosing between the extremes of harsh punishment or complete forgiveness, she announces a complex solution that addresses multiple aspects of the situation. Aduk must provide labor to Enlil during the coming planting season, compensation that recognizes the victim's loss while acknowledging the perpetrator's capacity to make amends. Additionally, he must undergo a ritual of public acknowledgement that serves both to demonstrate his acceptance of responsibility and to reinforce community values for all witnesses. The punishment's temporal dimension reflects deep understanding of how consequences can serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The labor requirement ensures practical restitution while creating opportunities for Aduk and Enlil to rebuild their relationship through shared work. The public ritual satisfies the community's need for acknowledgement of wrongdoing while providing Aduk with a clear path towards social redemption. The combination of practical and symbolic elements creates a resolution that addresses both immediate needs and long-term social harmony. The community's reaction to Kesh's judgment reveals the complex psychology of collective decision-making in societies where consensus is essential for survival. While not everyone is completely satisfied with the resolution, most members recognize its wisdom in balancing competing demands and interests. The few who advocate for harsher punishment gradually accept the decision as they understand its logic, while those who favored more lenient treatment appreciate its recognition of Aduk's desperate circumstances. The implementation of Aduk's punishment creates unexpected opportunities for social healing and community growth. As he works alongside Enlil in the fields during the crucial planting season, their relationship evolves from victim and perpetrator to collaborators in the essential work of community survival. The physical labor becomes a form of communication that transcends the awkwardness of their situation, allowing them to rebuild trust through shared effort and mutual dependence. The children of the settlement, those keen observers of adult behavior, incorporate the events surrounding Aduk's theft and punishment into their games and stories, creating a form of cultural transmission that will ensure these lessons are remembered long after the immediate participants have passed away. Their play scenarios explore themes of temptation, consequence, and redemption, processing the complex moral issues through the safe medium of imagination and creating a shared understanding of community values. The ripple effects of this first formal exercise in community justice extend far beyond the immediate participants to influence every aspect of social organization. The establishment of formal procedures for addressing transgression creates new roles and responsibilities within the community, leading to the emergence of specialized positions for those who demonstrate wisdom in mediating disputes and maintaining social harmony. These proto-legal roles represent humanity's first steps toward the professional justice systems that will characterize all future civilizations. The documentation of this case, though not written in the modern sense, becomes embedded in the community's oral tradition through carefully structured narratives that preserve both the facts of the situation and the reasoning behind the resolution. These stories, told and retold around evening fires, serve as legal precedents that guide future decision-making while reinforcing community values and expectations. The development of such precedent-based thinking represents a cognitive revolution that will prove essential for managing increasingly complex social organizations. The seasonal cycle that follows Aduk's punishment provides opportunities to assess the effectiveness of the community's justice system in achieving its intended goals. As the months pass and the community observes the results of their decision, they begin to understand how different types of consequences produce different outcomes. The success of Aduk's reintegration into community life validates their approach while providing insights that will inform future cases. The psychological transformation that Aduk undergoes during his punishment period reveals the complex relationship between consequences and behavioral change. The combination of practical work and social ritual create opportunities for genuine reflection and growth that pure punishment or simple forgiveness might not have achieved. His gradual reintegration into full community membership demonstrates the potential for justice systems to promote positive change rather than merely imposing negative consequences. The broader impact of this early experiment in formal justice extends to neighboring settlements through the networks of trade and intermarriage that connect these ancient communities. As word spreads of how Kesh's settlement resolved their case of food theft, other communities adapt and modify these approaches to fit their own circumstances and values. This cross-cultural exchange of legal innovations represents one of humanity's earliest examples of institutional learning and adaptation. The success of the restorative approach pioneered in Kesh's settlement influences the development of similar systems across the ancient Near East, creating a tradition of justice that emphasizes healing and reintegration rather than pure retribution. This philosophical foundation will echo through the legal traditions of many cultures, from ancient Hebrew concepts of jubilee and restoration to modern alternative justice programs that seek to repair harm rather than simply punish wrongdoing. The codification tendencies that emerge in larger settlements like Tel Es-Sawan begin to influence smaller communities as they recognize the advantages of having consistent, predictable responses to common problems.
The development of formal legal codes represents a fundamental shift in human thinking about justice, moving from contextual relationship-based decision-making toward universal principles that can be applied regardless of personal connections or individual circumstances. The tension between formal law and contextual justice becomes a defining characteristic of human legal development. As societies struggle to balance the efficiency and predictability of codified systems with the flexibility and wisdom of case-by-case consideration, the communities that successfully navigate this tension develop legal frameworks that combine clear principles with mechanisms for considering individual circumstances, creating precedents that will influence legal thinking for millennia. The emergence of specialized legal rules in response to these early justice experiments creates new forms of social authority and responsibility that will profoundly influence the development of human civilization. The individuals who demonstrate skill in mediating disputes and crafting wise resolutions begin to be recognized as essential community resources, leading to the development of formal institutions for training and supporting legal practitioners. The psychological insights that emerge from these early justice experiments reveal sophisticated understanding of human motivation and behavior change that rivals modern criminological theory. The communities that develop the most effective approaches to dealing with transgression are those that recognize the complex interplay between individual needs, social pressure, practical consequences, and symbolic meaning in shaping human behavior. The economic implications of different justice systems become apparent as communities compare the costs and benefits of various approaches to handling transgression.
The labor-intensive restoration model requires significant community time and energy, but produces outcomes that strengthen social bonds and increase productive capacity. The exile model conserves immediate resources but risks losing valuable community members and their contributions to collective welfare. The codified punishment model provides efficiency and consistency but may lack the flexibility needed to address unique circumstances. The spiritual and ritual dimensions of early justice systems reflect deep human understanding of the connection between individual behavior and cosmic order. Many communities develop elaborate ceremonies and symbolic acts that serve to restore not just social harmony but spiritual balance, recognizing that transgression disrupts relationships that extend beyond immediate human interactions to encompass the natural and supernatural forces that govern existence. The gender dynamics that emerge in these early justice systems reveal complex patterns of authority and responsibility that reflect broader social organization. While leadership roles may be predominantly male in some communities, the wisdom and experience of elder women like Quiche often prove essential in crafting resolutions that address the full complexity of human relationships and community needs. The intergenerational transmission of legal knowledge and values through these early justice experiments creates stable foundations for community development that allows settlements to grow and prosper over time. The communities that develop effective mechanisms for passing on wisdom about conflict resolution and social harmony prove more resilient in the face of challenges and more attractive to potential new members seeking stable social environments. The environmental factors that influence these early justice systems reveal the profound connection between legal development and ecological circumstances. Communities in harsh environments tend to develop stricter approaches to resource theft, while those in more abundant settings can afford more lenient responses. The seasonal nature of agricultural life creates legal frameworks that recognize temporal variations in resources and capacity, leading to sophisticated understanding of timing and context in justice. The trade networks that begin to develop between settlements create new challenges and opportunities for legal innovation, as communities must develop mechanisms for resolving disputes that cross cultural and geographic boundaries. The solutions they develop for handling intercommunity conflicts lay the groundwork for international law and diplomatic practices that will become essential as human societies grow in size and complexity. The technological innovations that support these early justice systems, from improved storage methods that reduce theft opportunities to communication systems that enable better coordination of community responses, demonstrate the intimate connection between technological development and social organization. The communities that successfully integrate technological and legal innovations prove most successful in managing the challenges of settled life. The long-term consequences of these early experiments in human justice extend far beyond their immediate historical context to influence the fundamental structures of civilization itself. The precedents established in settlements like Keshe's community echo through the development of legal systems in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, creating intellectual foundations that continue to influence modern approaches to law and justice. The philosophical questions raised by these early justice experiments, the nature of individual responsibility, the purposes of punishment, the relationship between individual rights and collective welfare, remain central to human legal and ethical thinking thousands of years later.
The wisdom gained from these ancient experiences continues to inform contemporary debates about criminal justice, restorative practices, and the proper role of law in human society. As we observe these ancient communities grappling with the fundamental challenges of living together in permanent settlements, we witness the birth of concepts and institutions that remain essential to human civilization. Their struggles to balance justice with mercy, individual accountability with collective welfare, and practical necessity with moral principle reveal insights about human nature and social organization that transcend their historical context to offer guidance for our own continuing experiments in creating just and sustainable societies. Deep beneath the accumulated soil of millennia, the material remains of humanity's earliest experiments with justice lie buried in the archaeological record, waiting to tell their silent stories to those who know how to listen. Imagine yourself as an archaeologist carefully brushing away the dust of 7,000 years, revealing layer by layer the physical evidence of how our ancestors dealt with transgression and punishment in their fragile communities. The artifacts that emerge from these ancient settlement sites speak in a language of broken pottery, disturbed storage areas, and unusual burial practices that reveal the hidden history of crime and consequence in the dawn of civilization. The excavations at Çatalhöyük, that remarkable Neolithic settlement in central Turkey, provide some of our most intimate glimpses into the daily realities of early community life and the challenges of maintaining social order.
As archaeologists carefully uncover the plastered floors and mud brick walls of houses that sheltered families 9,000 years ago, they discover a fascinating array of evidence that speaks to the constant tension between abundance and scarcity, trust and suspicion that characterize these early experiments in settled living. In House 52, located in the southern area of the settlement, excavators uncovered a storage room that tells a compelling story of ancient theft and its consequences. The carefully arranged pottery vessels that once held the family's precious grain stores show clear signs of disturbance, with several large jars broken in ways that suggest hasty removal of contents rather than accidental damage. The fragments lie scattered across the floor in patterns that speak of urgent, clandestine activity rather than the careful handling that such valuable containers would normally receive. The microscopic analysis of soil samples from this storage area reveals traces of spilled grain that was never cleaned up, suggesting that the disturbance occurred under circumstances that prevented normal household maintenance. Carbon dating places this event during a particularly harsh winter period, when pollen analysis indicates that natural food sources would have been severely limited. The convergence of environmental stress and evidence of unauthorized access to stored resources creates a compelling archaeological narrative of desperation and transgression. But perhaps most intriguing is what the excavators found sealed beneath a fresh layer of plaster in the corner of this same storage room. A small cache of objects that appears to represent some form of ritual offering or a symbolic compensation.
The collection includes carefully shaped obsidian blades, polished stone beads, and fragments of exotic shells that could only have come from distant coastal areas. The deliberate placement and careful sealing of these valuable items suggests they may represent restitution or symbolic payment related to the theft, providing physical evidence of the complex systems of justice and restoration that these ancient communities developed. The analysis of wear patterns on grinding stones throughout Çatalhöyük settlement reveals fascinating insights into how communities monitored and managed food resources during times of scarcity. Stones showing unusual patterns of late-night use, indicated by the presence of lamp soot and ash residues, not typically found during normal daylight grinding activities, suggest that some households were processing grain during hours when such activity would not be visible to neighbors. This clandestine food preparation may indicate hoarding behaviors or the processing of illicitly obtained grain under cover of darkness. The distribution of storage facilities throughout different areas of the settlement shows clear evidence of evolving security measures in response to theft concerns. Earlier phases of occupation show relatively open storage arrangements with large communal granaries accessible to multiple households. Later phases reveal increasingly privatized and secured storage systems, with individual family storage areas located deep within private dwellings and protected by multiple layers of walls and access controls. This architectural evolution provides compelling evidence of how theft concerns influence the physical design of early settlements. The remarkable preservation conditions at Çatalhöyük have allowed archaeologists to recover organic materials that provide unprecedented insights into ancient security measures. The collection includes carefully shaped obsidian blades, polished stone beads, and fragments of exotic shells that could only have come from distant coastal areas. The deliberate placement and careful sealing of these valuable items suggests they may represent restitution or symbolic payment related to the theft, providing physical evidence of the complex systems of justice and restoration that these ancient communities developed. The analysis of wear patterns on grinding stones throughout Çatalhöyük settlement reveals fascinating insights into how communities monitored and managed food resources during times of scarcity. Stones showing unusual patterns of late-night use, indicated by the presence of lamp soot and ash residues not typically found during normal daylight grinding activities, suggest that some households were processing grain during hours when such activity would not be visible to neighbors. This clandestine food preparation may indicate hoarding behaviors or the processing of illicitly obtained grain under cover of darkness. The distribution of storage facilities throughout different areas of the settlement shows clear evidence of evolving security measures in response to theft concerns. Earlier phases of occupation show relatively open storage arrangements with large communal granaries accessible to multiple households. Later phases reveal increasingly privatized and secured storage systems, with individual family storage areas located deep within private dwellings and protected by multiple layers of walls and access controls. This architectural evolution provides compelling evidence of how theft concerns influenced the physical design of early settlements. The remarkable preservation conditions at Çatalhöyük have allowed archaeologists to recover organic materials that provide unprecedented insights into ancient security measures. The collection includes carefully shaped obsidian blades, polished stone beads, and fragments of exotic shells that could only have come from distant coastal areas. The deliberate placement and careful sealing of these valuable items suggests they may represent restitution or symbolic payment related to the theft, providing physical evidence of the complex systems of justice and restoration that these ancient communities developed. The analysis of wear patterns on grinding stones throughout Çatalhöyük settlement reveals fascinating insights into how communities monitored and managed food resources during times of scarcity. Stones showing unusual patterns of late-night use, indicated by the presence of lamp soot and ash residues not typically found during normal daylight grinding activities, suggest that some households were processing grain during hours when such activity would not be visible to neighbors. This clandestine food preparation may indicate hoarding behaviors or the processing of illicitly obtained grain under cover of darkness. The distribution of storage facilities throughout different areas of the settlement shows clear evidence of evolving security measures in response to theft concerns. Earlier phases of occupation show relatively open storage arrangements with large communal granaries accessible to multiple households. Later phases reveal increasingly privatized and secured storage systems, with individual family storage areas located deep within private dwellings and protected by multiple layers of walls and access controls. This architectural evolution provides compelling evidence of how theft concerns influenced the physical design of early settlements. The remarkable preservation conditions at Çatalhöyük have allowed archaeologists to recover organic materials that provide unprecedented insights into ancient security measures. This architectural evidence provides compelling support for the development of formal justice systems during the early Neolithic period. The residential areas of Tel es Sawan show clear evidence of social stratification that influenced how different community members were treated when accused of crimes. The larger, more elaborate dwellings contain storage facilities that are both more numerous and more secure than those found in smaller houses, suggesting that wealth and status affected both the risk of becoming a theft victim and the resources available for preventing such crimes. The differential treatment of individuals based on social position represents an early example of how justice systems can reflect and reinforce existing inequalities. The material culture recovered from Tel es Sawan includes several artifacts that appear to be early examples of formal punishment implements. Stone objects shaped specifically for restraining or marking individuals provide physical evidence of how communities developed specialized tools for enforcing their decisions about crime and punishment. The careful craftsmanship evident in these implements suggests that they held important ceremonial or symbolic significance beyond their practical function. The site of Ain Ghazal in Jordan offers yet another perspective on ancient approaches to crime and punishment through its remarkable collection of plastered human skulls and full-figure statues. While the primary purpose of these artifacts appears to be religious or commemorative, several show evidence of deliberate damage or modification that may relate to punishment or social control. The selective destruction of certain facial features on some sculptures could represent a form of symbolic punishment or social ostracism that accompanied more practical consequences for community violations.
The analysis of ancient DNA recovered from burial sites across the ancient Near East reveals population movements and social relationships that provide context for understanding crime and punishment in early communities.
Individuals buried in unusual circumstances or positions often show genetic markers indicating they were not originally from the communities where they died, suggesting that exile and ostracism were common responses to serious transgressions. The reintegration of such individuals into different communities provides evidence of networks of communication and cooperation between settlements that may have included formal arrangements for handling criminals and refugees. The recovery of early writing systems and symbolic notation from sites like Uruk and Susa provides direct evidence of how communities began to formalize their approaches to justice and record-keeping. Clay tablets containing what appear to be legal records include references to theft, restitution, and punishment that confirm the archaeological evidence for sophisticated justice systems. The development of writing specifically for legal purposes represents a revolutionary advancement in human social organization that made possible the complex legal codes that would characterize later civilizations. The environmental archaeology of early settlement sites reveals how climate change and resource scarcity influenced crime rates and community responses to transgression. Periods of drought or crop failure, as indicated by pollen analysis and soil chemistry, correlate with evidence of increased theft and social tension within settlements. The archaeological record shows how communities adapted their justice systems to address the heightened conflicts that arose during environmental stress, developing more elaborate systems of resource sharing and conflict resolution.
The comparative analysis of justice-related artifacts across different early settlements reveals remarkable consistency in certain approaches to crime and punishment, suggesting that these solutions represented fundamental insights into human nature and social organization that transcended cultural and geographic boundaries. The widespread appearance of similar security measures, punishment implements, and ceremonial justice artifacts indicates that early communities were engaged in extensive communication and learning about effective methods for maintaining social order. The preservation of organic materials at waterlogged sites like the Swiss Lake dwellings provides unprecedented insights into the daily realities of crime prevention and punishment in early communities. Wooden stakes driven into lake beds show evidence of being used as temporary restraining devices, while recovered textiles include ropes and bindings that may have been used for punishment or control purposes. The excellent preservation conditions at these sites allow archaeologists to reconstruct complete sequences of events related to crime and punishment with remarkable detail and accuracy. The discovery of elaborate ceremonial complexes at sites across the ancient world reveals that justice in early communities involved far more than simple practical consequences for wrongdoing. As archaeologists uncover the remains of ritual platforms, ceremonial fire pits, and sacred enclosures associated with evidence of legal proceedings, a complex picture emerges of how our ancestors understood the relationship between earthly justice and cosmic order. These sacred spaces, where the boundaries between human law and divine will became blurred, tell us that ancient peoples recognized justice as a fundamentally spiritual act that required supernatural sanction to be truly effective.
The remarkable circular stone structure discovered at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dating to nearly 12,000 years ago, provides our earliest evidence of formalized spaces designed specifically for community gatherings that may have included judicial functions. The massive T-shaped pillars, carved with intricate animal reliefs and abstract symbols, stand as silent witnesses to ceremonies we can only imagine. Recent analysis of soil samples from around these pillars reveals traces of human blood, burned grain, and other organic materials that suggest complex rituals involving sacrifice, offering, and perhaps the ceremonial resolution of conflicts that threatened community harmony. The positioning of the Göbekli Tepe pillars creates acoustic properties that would have amplified and focused sound in ways that enhance the dramatic impact of spoken words during ceremonies. Modern experiments with replica structures demonstrate how a speaker positioned at the center of the circle could project their voice with supernatural clarity and resonance, creating an almost mystical atmosphere that would have lent tremendous authority to judicial pronouncements. The ancient architects who designed these spaces understood the psychological power of environmental manipulation in creating settings appropriate for the most serious community decisions. The animal imagery carved into the Göbekli Tepe pillars provides fascinating insights into how early peoples understood the connection between human justice and natural order. Snakes, scorpions, wild boars, and birds of prey dominate the carved reliefs, creatures that represent both danger and protection in the natural world. The careful positioning of these images suggests they may have served as symbolic witnesses to human proceedings, representing the cosmic forces that would enforce divine justice when human institutions proved inadequate. The discovery of deliberately buried caches of carved stone objects near the Göbekli Tepe complex reveals ritualized abandonment practices that may be connected to legal ceremonies. These buried artifacts, which include carefully shaped bowls, symbolic weapons, and mysterious carved plaques, appear to have been interred as part of formal ceremonies rather than simply discarded. The parallels between these burial practices and ethnographic accounts of ritual destruction following major judicial decisions suggest that ancient communities understood the need to mark significant legal precedents through ceremonial acts that would be remembered by future generations. The excavations at Navali Chori, another early ceremonial center in Turkey, have reviewed evidence of what may be humanity's earliest example of a formal oath-taking ceremony connected to legal proceedings. A circular stone platform surrounded by carved pillars shows wear patterns consistent with repeated use for formal gatherings, while the discovery of deliberately placed human finger bones around the platform's perimeter suggests rituals involving physical sacrifice or marking to bind participants to the sworn statements. The symbolic artifacts recovered from Navali Chori include carved stone truth stones that may have been used in formal testimony procedures. These carefully shaped objects, each unique in their markings and proportions, appear to have been held or touched by individuals making statements during legal proceedings. The stones show polished patterns consistent with repeated handling in formal context, while their symbolic decorations may have been believed to detect falsehood or ensure truthful testimony through supernatural means. The ritual fire features discovered at sites throughout the ancient Near East provide compelling evidence of how communities used sacred flames to sanctify their judicial decisions. The fire altar at Chaioni in Turkey, dating to the 8th millennium BC, shows evidence of regular use for burning specific combinations of plant materials and animal offerings. Chemical analyses of the altar's residues reveals the presence of psychoactive compounds that may have been used to induce altered states of consciousness in participants, allowing them to commune with supernatural forces before making important community decisions. The practice of ritual fire-making for judicial purposes appears to have involved complex procedures designed to ensure the purity and effectiveness of the ceremony. Evidence from multiple sites suggests that the fires used for legal ceremonies had to be kindled using specific methods, fed with particular types of fuel, and maintained according to strict protocols that preserved their sacred character. The failure to follow these procedures properly was believed to invalidate any decisions made in the fire's presence, creating powerful incentives for scrupulous attention to ritual detail. The human skeletal remains discovered in contexts associated with these ceremonial fire sites reveal evidence of individuals who may have been sacrificed or executed as part of judicial proceedings. Several sites contain burials of individuals who show signs of violent death but were interred with unusual care and accompanied by valuable grave goods, suggesting they may have been ritual victims whose deaths served specific legal or ceremonial purposes rather than simple executions. The practice of creating memorial installations to commemorate significant legal decisions reveals how ancient communities understood the importance of preserving judicial precedents for future reference.
The stone circles and marker installations discovered at sites throughout Europe and the Near East often contain evidence of ceremonial activities that appear to be connected to the commemoration of important community decisions. These monuments served as physical reminders of legal precedents and gathering places for future judicial ceremonies. The analysis of ancient astronomical alignments at ceremonial sites reveals sophisticated understanding of how cosmic cycles influence the timing of judicial proceedings. Many early legal centers are positioned to mark important solar and lunar events, suggesting that ancient communities believed certain times were more propitious for making legal decisions
decisions than others. The calendar systems implied by these alignments indicate complex scheduling procedures that ensure judicial ceremonies took place under the most favorable supernatural conditions. The recovery of early writing systems and symbolic notation from ceremonial contexts provides direct evidence of how communities began to record and preserve their judicial decisions for future reference. The proto-writing systems discovered at sites like Uruk and Hierakonpolis include symbols and notation systems that appear to be specifically designed for legal record-keeping, representing humanity's earliest attempts to create permanent documentation of judicial proceedings and their outcomes. The comparative analysis of ceremonial judicial artifacts across different ancient cultures reveals remarkable consistency in certain symbolic elements, suggesting that fundamental concepts about divine justice and cosmic order were shared across wide geographic and cultural boundaries. The appearance of similar ceremonial objects, architectural features, and ritual practices at sites separated by thousands of miles and centuries indicates that early human communities were engaged in extensive communication about effective methods for accessing supernatural authority in judicial contexts.
The evidence for the use of mind-altering substances in judicial ceremonies provides fascinating insights into how ancient communities accessed what they believed to be supernatural wisdom for making legal decisions. Chemical analyses of residues from ceremonial vessels and fire installations reveals the presence of various psychoactive compounds that may have been used to induce visionary states in legal authorities, allowing them to receive divine guidance about appropriate responses to community conflicts and transgressions. As we delve deeper into the archaeological record of humanity's earliest experiments with justice and social order, we encounter a series of tantalizing mysteries that continue to challenge our understanding of how ancient communities addressed crime and punishment. These enigmatic artifacts, unusual burial practices, and puzzling architectural features suggest that early human societies developed approaches to justice that were far more complex and sophisticated than we might expect, yet their true meanings remain frustratingly elusive, hidden behind the veil of time and the limitations of material evidence. Perhaps nowhere is this mystery more apparent than in the remarkable discovery of the so-called judgment stones found at sites across Europe and the Near East. These carefully carved megalithic monuments, many weighing several tons and positioned with astronomical precision, bear intricate symbolic markings that appear to be related to legal or judicial functions. The stones themselves seem to serve as permanent records of important community decisions, their carved surfaces telling stories we can only partially decipher about ancient concepts of justice, authority, and cosmic order.
The most intriguing examples of these judgment stones can be found at the megalithic complex of Karnak in Brittany, where over 3,000 standing stones create elaborate patterns across the landscape that have puzzled archaeologists for generations. Recent analysis using ground-penetrating radar and advanced imaging techniques has revealed that many of these stones are positioned over carefully constructed underground chambers containing human remains and ritual artifacts that suggest judicial or ceremonial purposes. The individuals buried beneath these stones show evidence of violent death, but their elaborate grave goods and careful positioning suggest they may have been willing participants in ritual sacrifices or formal executions related to community justice. The symbolic markings carved into the Karnak stones include recurring motifs that appear to represent legal concepts or procedural elements. Spiral patterns that may symbolize the cyclical nature of justice, interconnected circles that could represent community consensus, and linear arrangements that might indicate hierarchical authority structures create a complex symbolic language that speaks to a sophisticated understanding of legal principles. Yet, despite decades of study, the precise meaning of these symbols remains a matter of scholarly debate, their ancient significance locked away behind our incomplete understanding of Neolithic symbolic systems. The discovery of similar carved stones at sites throughout Atlantic Europe suggests that these monuments were part of a widespread tradition of commemorating judicial decisions through permanent stone records. The consistency of certain symbolic elements across vast geographic distances indicates extensive communication networks between ancient communities, sharing not only trade goods and technological innovations, but also legal concepts and ceremonial practices.
The effort required to create these massive monuments demonstrates the tremendous importance that ancient societies placed on preserving judicial precedents for future generations. The mysterious bog bodies discovered throughout northern Europe present yet another puzzle in our understanding of ancient crime and punishment. These remarkably preserved human remains found in peat bogs that created perfect conditions for organic preservation often show evidence of violent death that has led many researchers to conclude they were victims of ritual execution or human sacrifice. The careful analysis of these individuals reveals details about their final days that provide fascinating insights into ancient judicial practices. The bog body known as Tolen Man, discovered in Denmark and dating to approximately 400 BC, shows evidence of having consumed a final meal consisting of a carefully prepared mixture of grains and wild plants. The specific combination of ingredients in this last meal appears to have been deliberately chosen for symbolic rather than nutritional purposes, suggesting it may have been part of a formal ritual preceding execution. The rope around Tolen Man's neck, made from carefully twisted plant fibers, shows craftsmanship that indicates it was specifically created for ceremonial rather than practical purposes. The positioning of bog bodies within their watery graves reveals sophisticated understanding of symbolic geography and ritual space. Many individuals were placed in specific locations within bogs that held special significance for ancient communities, often at boundaries between territories or near sacred springs that were believed to connect the earthly and supernatural realms.
The careful arrangement of bodies and grave goods suggests that these sites were chosen not merely for their preservative qualities, but for their spiritual significance in ancient cosmological systems. The elaborate underground complexes discovered at sites throughout the Mediterranean region present another category of archaeological mystery that may be related to ancient justice systems. The vast underground chambers carved into bedrock at sites like Derinkuyu in Turkey and the Hypogeum at Hal Saflieni in Malta show evidence of use for purposes that extend beyond simple storage or habitation. The acoustic properties of these underground spaces, combined with evidence of ceremonial activities, suggest they may have served as venues for secret judicial proceedings or ritual punishments that required concealment from the general community. The discovery of human remains in specific chambers within these underground complexes provides evidence of their potential judicial functions. Individuals buried in these subterranean contexts often show evidence of violent death and unusual burial practices that distinguish them from normal interments. The careful positioning of bodies and grave goods within the complex architectural layouts suggests these spaces were designed with specific ceremonial purposes in mind, possibly including the conduct of legal proceedings that required supernatural authority or absolute secrecy. The sophisticated engineering required to create these underground judicial venues demonstrates the tremendous importance that ancient communities placed on having appropriate spaces for legal ceremonies. The effort involved in excavating thousands of cubic meters of bedrock, creating complex ventilation systems, and constructing elaborate architectural features indicates that these projects represented major community investments that required generations to complete.
The commitment of such resources to judicial infrastructure suggests that ancient peoples understood effective justice systems as essential foundations for social stability and prosperity. The mysterious stone chambers and passage graves found throughout Atlantic Europe contain artifact assemblages that may provide evidence of early legal documentation systems we do not yet understand. Carved stone slabs covered with intricate symbolic markings appear to record information in systematic ways that suggest formal record-keeping, yet the symbolic systems used resist decipherment using conventional archaeological methods. The recurring appearance of certain motifs and their apparent relationship to astronomical events indicates sophisticated understanding of timekeeping and ceremonial scheduling that may be related to judicial procedures. The discovery of elaborate metalwork in contexts associated with justice and legal authority presents another fascinating area of archaeological mystery. The ceremonial weapons, ornate vessels, and symbolic objects recovered from early legal centers often display craftsmanship that far exceeds practical requirements, suggesting they served important symbolic or ritual functions in judicial ceremonies. The investment of precious metals and skilled labor in creating these objects indicates their tremendous importance in ancient justice systems, yet their specific uses and meanings often remain unclear. The isotopic analysis of these metal artifacts reveals that many were created using materials from distant sources, indicating extensive trade networks specifically dedicated to supplying ceremonial objects for legal purposes. The efforts required to obtain exotic materials and transport them over vast distances demonstrates the pan-regional importance of certain judicial traditions and the willingness of ancient communities to invest significant resources in maintaining proper ceremonial standards.
The interdisciplinary collaboration between archaeologists, anthropologists, legal historians, and other specialists continues to generate new insights into the connections between ancient and modern justice systems. The recognition that contemporary legal traditions have deep prehistoric roots has important implications for understanding both the evolution of human social organization and the potential directions for future legal development. The mysteries embedded in the archaeological record of ancient justice serve not only as puzzles to be solved, but as sources of inspiration for addressing the continuing challenges of creating fair and effective systems for organizing human societies. As the sun sets over our ancient settlement and the daily routines of survival give way to the quieter contemplations of evening, we must confront one of the most troubling aspects of early human justice: the ways in which social hierarchies influenced how communities responded to crime and transgression. While we have thus far explored justice as it applied to community members of roughly equal standing, the reality of ancient social organization was far more complex, with emerging class distinctions that fundamentally altered how different individuals experienced both the temptation to steal and the consequences when caught. Imagine yourself as a witness to the gradual stratification that transforms egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands into the hierarchical societies that characterize early agricultural settlements. This transformation, subtle at first but accelerating over generations, creates new categories of people with different relationships to resources, authority, and justice itself.
The grain that a Duk stole from Enlil represents more than simple sustenance. It embodies the revolutionary concept that some individuals can accumulate wealth while others face scarcity, that social position can determine access to life's necessities, and that justice must somehow account for these inequalities. The archaeological evidence from sites like Çatalhöyük reveals the earliest stages of this social transformation through the careful analysis of dwelling sizes, burial goods, and access to resources. In the early phases of the settlement, houses show remarkable uniformity in size and construction, suggesting a largely egalitarian society where families enjoyed roughly equal status and resources. The storage areas, toolkits, and personal possessions recovered from these early dwellings indicate that while individual households might experience temporary variations in fortune, no permanent class of wealthy or poor individuals had yet emerged. But as we examine the later phases of occupation at Çatalhöyük, a different picture begins to emerge. Certain houses grow larger and more elaborate, their walls decorated with intricate paintings, and their storage areas expanded to accommodate greater quantities of goods. The burials associated with these more elaborate dwellings contain richer grave goods, obsidian mirrors, elaborate textiles, jewelry made from exotic materials that speak to the accumulation of wealth and status by specific families or lineages. This archaeological evidence documents the birth of social inequality, the moment when human societies first divided into those who have and those who have not. The emergence of social elites creates entirely new categories of potential criminals and victims that communities must learn to address through their evolving justice systems.
When Bazu, the daughter of Çatalhöyük's most successful traders, is discovered stealing bread from a poorer family's modest store, the community faces a crisis that challenges their fundamental assumptions about crime and punishment. How should they respond when the thief comes from a wealthy family while the victim struggles with genuine poverty? Does social status affect the severity of the crime, the appropriateness of punishment, or the community's expectations for restitution?
The psychological dynamics that drive elite crime reveal fascinating insights into human nature and the unintended consequences of social stratification. Bazoo's theft appears to be motivated not by desperate hunger, but by a more complex mix of entitlement, curiosity, and perhaps rebellion against the social constraints that accompany her privileged position. Her family's wealth ensures that she has never experienced genuine scarcity, yet this very security may have prevented her from developing the empathy and social awareness that help others understand the true impact of their actions on community welfare. The community's initial response to Bazoo's crime reveals the confusion and uncertainty that arise when established justice procedures encounter unprecedented social circumstances. Cash, the wise elder whose judgment had seemed so clear in Aduk's case, now finds herself grappling with questions that have no obvious answers. Should Bazoo be held to the same standards as other community members, or do her family's contributions to community welfare warrant special consideration? Does her social position make her crime more serious because she violated the trust that accompanies privilege, or less serious because her actions stemmed from ignorance rather than desperation?
The victim's perspective in this case adds another layer of complexity to the community's deliberations. Ahura, the mother whose bread was stolen, faces her own difficult choices about how to respond to this unprecedented situation. Her family's poverty makes them dependent on the goodwill and trade relationships that Bazoo's wealthy family can provide, creating powerful incentives to minimize the seriousness of the crime and avoid confrontation. Yet accepting such treatment without protest risks establishing precedents that could make all poor families vulnerable to exploitation by their wealthier neighbors. The long-term implications of allowing wealth to influence justice outcomes become apparent as the community observes how Dumuzi's intervention affects subsequent cases involving elite families. When other wealthy individuals face accusations of wrongdoing, they increasingly rely on their resources to provide compensation that exceeds the actual damage caused, transforming justice from a process of accountability and moral education into a form of commercial transaction. This commodification of justice threatens to undermine the very foundations of community trust and mutual responsibility that make settled life possible. The development of different legal standards for different social classes represents one of humanity's most troubling innovations in social organization, yet it emerges almost inevitably from the practical challenges of managing increasingly complex societies. The community's attempts to create fair procedures that account for social differences lead to elaborate systems of graduated punishments that consider not only the nature of the crime, but the status of both perpetrator and victim. These early experiments with class-based justice systems establish precedents that will influence legal thinking for thousands of years.
The emergence of specialized legal roles for elite family members reveals how social stratification transforms the very nature of community decision-making processes. Individuals like Dumuzi, whose wealth and influence give them disproportionate power within the community, begin to assume informal roles as advocates and mediators that gradually formalize into permanent positions of legal authority. This concentration of judicial power within elite families creates opportunities for manipulation and bias that threaten the fairness and legitimacy of the entire justice system. The creation of exclusive legal procedures for elite families represents a fundamental departure from the inclusive, participatory justice systems that characterized earlier egalitarian societies. When wealthy families begin to demand private hearings for their legal disputes, citing the need to protect sensitive business relationships or family reputations, they create parallel justice systems that operate according to different rules and standards. These exclusive procedures, while initially justified as necessary accommodations for complex social circumstances, gradually evolve into formal privileges that exempt elite families from the same accountability standards applied to ordinary community members. The technological dimensions of elite crime emerge as wealthy families gain access to advanced tools and techniques that ordinary community members cannot afford or understand. When elite individuals use their superior resources to commit crimes that ordinary people could not accomplish, communities must develop new expertise and procedures for addressing forms of wrongdoing that may be invisible to traditional investigation methods. The increasing sophistication of elite crimes requires corresponding advances in community detection and prevention capabilities that may strain limited resources and expertise. As the seasons turn in our ancient settlement, and the social divisions that began as subtle differences in household fortune gradually hardened into permanent class distinctions, we witness the emergence of entirely separate systems of justice that operate according to different principles for different categories of people. The comfortable distance that elite families maintain from the daily struggles of survival creates not only economic privilege, but moral blindness that fundamentally alters their relationship to community standards and expectations. This separation between the powerful and the powerless becomes most apparent when wealthy individuals transgress against social norms, revealing how privilege can both protect transgressors and corrupt the very foundations of community justice. The case of Nlobane, grandson of the settlement's most successful trade family, provides a stark illustration of how elite status transforms the entire framework within which crime and punishment are understood. When this young man, raised in comfort and security that most community members can barely imagine, is discovered systematically stealing from multiple households over a period of months, his crimes reveal patterns of behavior that challenge every assumption about motivation, accountability, and appropriate consequences that the community has developed through their previous experience with food theft. Unlike Aduk's desperate act of survival, or even Bazu's impulsive transgression, Nlobane's thefts appear to be motivated by neither hunger nor immediate need, but by a complex psychology of entitlement, thrill-seeking, and contempt for the ordinary families whose stores he has violated.
The sophisticated methods he employs, carefully studying household routines, creating false bottoms in storage vessels to conceal missing quantities, and manipulating social relationships to avoid suspicion, reveal a calculating intelligence that makes his crimes far more disturbing than simple acts of desperate hunger. The discovery of Nlobane's elaborate theft operation begins not through community vigilance, but through the accidental revelation of his private stores hidden in a cave system outside the settlement, where he has accumulated stolen goods far beyond any conceivable personal need. The cache that investigators uncover contains not only food items from dozens of different households, but also tools, ornaments, and ceremonial objects that suggest his crimes extended far beyond simple hunger into realms of psychological compulsion and social dominance that the community has never before encountered. The community's initial shock at discovering the scope of Nlobane's crimes gives way to deeper concerns about the implications of his behavior for their entire social system. The young man's ability to operate undetected for months reveals vulnerabilities in their community oversight systems that elite individuals can exploit through superior resources and social connections. His crimes call into question not only individual accountability, but the fundamental trustworthiness of the emerging elite class and their fitness to hold positions of community leadership and responsibility. The elaborate legal maneuvering that follows Nlobane's discovery demonstrates how elite families can use their resources and influence to subvert justice systems originally designed to serve the entire community fairly.
Teams of advocates, speaking on behalf of the family's various business interests and social obligations, argue for special consideration based on the family's past contributions to community welfare, their current economic importance, and the potential disruption that harsh punishment might cause to ongoing trade relationships and development projects. The community's struggle to respond appropriately to Nlobane's crimes reveals the corrosive effects that significant wealth inequality has on traditional justice systems. The procedures that worked effectively for addressing crimes among individuals of roughly equal social standing prove inadequate for cases where perpetrators possess resources and influence that dwarf those available to their victims. The very complexity of elite crime requires investigation and adjudication capabilities that strain the informal consensus-based systems that had previously served the community's needs. The psychological analysis of Nlobane's behavior that emerges from extended community deliberation reveals disturbing insights into how extreme privilege can distort individual moral development. His upbringing and isolation from genuine scarcity or consequence appears to have prevented the development of empathy and social awareness that normally constrain antisocial behavior. The systematic nature of his crimes suggests not momentary weakness, but fundamental deficits in moral reasoning that may be inherent consequences of extreme social stratification. The victims of Enlil-Bani's theft operation, drawn from across the spectrum of ordinary families within the community, provide compelling testimony about the broader social impact of elite crime that extends far beyond simple material loss. The families who discover that their carefully managed food stores have been systematically violated describe feelings of violation, vulnerability, and betrayal that poison their sense of security and community belonging.
The psychological damage caused by discovering that their trust had been exploited by someone they had viewed as a community leader proves more lasting and destructive than the immediate economic harm. The ripple effects of Enlil-Bani's crimes on community social dynamics become apparent as ordinary families begin to question their relationships with all elite individuals and their confidence in traditional authority structures. The revelation that systematic exploitation had occurred under the protection of wealth and social position creates widespread cynicism about the fairness of community institutions and the trustworthiness of established leaders. This erosion of social trust threatens the cooperative relationships that make settled agricultural life possible. The attempted cover-up of Enlil-Bani's crimes by other elite families reveals how class solidarity can override community loyalty when wealthy individuals feel their collective interests are threatened. The discovery that several prominent families had knowledge of ongoing theft but chose to protect elite privilege rather than community welfare creates a secondary crisis of trust that may prove more damaging than the original crimes. The community faces the disturbing realization that their emerging elite class may view itself as separate from and superior to ordinary community standards. The creation of private arbitration systems for elite disputes reveals how wealthy families gradually withdraw from community justice institutions to create parallel legal frameworks that operate according to their own interests and priorities. These private systems, while initially limited to internal disputes between elite families, gradually expand to encompass all legal matters involving wealthy individuals, creating de facto legal immunity for an entire social class.
The economic analysis of elite crime reveals how systematic theft and exploitation by wealthy individuals can distort entire community economies in ways that may not be immediately apparent, but nonetheless cause significant long-term harm. The resources extracted through Enlil-Bani's operation, while representing relatively small amounts from each individual household, collectively constitute substantial wealth transfers that concentrated community resources in ways that increased inequality and reduced overall community welfare. The technological innovations developed in response to elite crime, including improved security measures, more sophisticated investigation techniques, and enhanced record-keeping systems, represent some of humanity's earliest investments in law enforcement capabilities, specifically designed to address crimes by powerful individuals. These innovations, while initially developed for specific cases, create institutional capabilities that transform community justice systems and establish precedents for more complex legal institutions. As the final shadows of evening settle over our ancient settlement and the stars begin their eternal dance across the darkening sky, we arrive at the culmination of our journey through humanity's earliest experiments with justice and social order. The contrasts that have emerged between how different classes of people experience crime and punishment reveal fundamental truths about human nature and social organization that continue to shape our world 7,000 years later. In these quiet moments, as families throughout the settlement settle into their evening routines, the disparities between their lives speak volumes about the price of civilization and the persistent challenges of creating truly just societies.
The daily reality for Uhura and her family, still struggling to recover from the theft that began our exploration, illustrates the enduring vulnerabilities that ordinary people face in societies where justice operates differently for different classes of individuals. Despite the formal resolution of her case and the community's apparent commitment to fairness, her family's position remains precarious in ways that reveal how temporary interventions cannot address the structural inequalities that make some individuals perpetual victims, while others enjoy lasting immunity from consequences. The contrast between these children's prospects and those of elite offspring like Enlil-Bani reveals how social stratification creates divergent life paths from the earliest ages. While Uhura's children learn lessons about scarcity, vulnerability, and the need for constant vigilance, elite children grow up with assumptions about entitlement, security, and immunity from consequences that shape their moral development in fundamentally different ways. These early experiences create psychological foundations that make genuine empathy and understanding across class lines increasingly difficult as individuals mature.
The evening gatherings that once brought the entire community together for shared meals and collective decision-making now reflect the social divisions that have emerged over generations of increasing inequality. Elite families increasingly withdraw into private social circles that reinforce their shared interests and perspectives, while ordinary families find themselves excluded from conversations and relationships that once provided access to community resources and influence. This social segregation creates parallel worlds within the same physical settlement that operate according to different rules and expectations.
The stories told around evening fires now serve to transmit and reinforce class-based understandings of justice, morality, and social responsibility that prepare children for their predetermined roles in hierarchical society. Elite families share narratives that emphasize their special responsibilities and superior wisdom, while ordinary families develop contra-narratives that help them cope with their subordinate position and maintain dignity despite systematic disadvantage. These competing mythologies create irreconcilable worldviews that make genuine dialogue and mutual understanding increasingly impossible. The evolution of Keisha's role as community arbiter reveals how even the wisest and most well-intentioned individuals can become complicit in systems that perpetuate injustice when structural inequalities make fair treatment impossible within existing frameworks. Her attempts to balance competing demands for fairness and stability have gradually transformed her from an impartial judge into a manager of elite privilege who must carefully navigate political pressures while maintaining the appearance of moral authority. The compromises required by this impossible position have eroded both her effectiveness and her spiritual connection to the principles that originally guided her decisions. The seasonal cycles that once governed community life according to natural rhythms now reflect artificial disconnections created by social hierarchy that determines who benefits from abundant times and who suffers during periods of scarcity. Elite families' ability to maintain comfortable lifestyles regardless of environmental conditions insulates them from the natural consequences that once motivated community cooperation and resource sharing. This disconnection from natural consequences removes important feedback mechanisms that had previously encouraged sustainable behavior and mutual responsibility. The marriage patterns that develop within increasingly stratified communities reveal how intimate relationships become vehicles for either perpetuating or challenging social inequalities. Elite families' preference for marriages within their own class creates closed social networks that concentrate wealth and power, while ordinary families find their marriage prospects limited by economic constraints that prevent them from forming alliances that might improve their social position. These marital strategies ensure that class divisions persist and intensify across generations. The education systems that emerge to prepare children for their roles in hierarchical society reveal how knowledge itself becomes a tool for maintaining social divisions. Elite children receive training in literacy, mathematics, and specialized skills that prepare them for leadership roles, while ordinary children learn only the practical skills necessary for subordinate positions. This differential access to knowledge creates cognitive advantages that elite families can claim justify their superior social position. The legal innovations developed to address elite crime gradually create formal systems of law that codify inequality and make it increasingly difficult to challenge unjust social arrangements through existing institutions. The specialized procedures, professional advocates, and complex restitution arrangements that emerge from cases like Enlil-Banais establish precedents that ensure wealthy individuals will always receive different treatment from ordinary criminals. These legal developments represent early stages in the evolution of formal law codes that will characterize all future civilizations. The psychological toll of systematic inequality on community mental health becomes apparent through increased levels of anxiety, depression, and social dysfunction that affect both perpetrators and victims of unjust systems.
Elite individuals, despite their material advantages, show signs of moral distress and spiritual emptiness that result from their disconnection from authentic community relationships and meaningful social purpose. Ordinary individuals develop stress-related disorders and learned helplessness that reduce their capacity for productive activity and positive social engagement. The environmental consequences of social stratification reveal how inequality affects not only human relationships, but also community sustainability and long-term survival. Elite families' excessive consumption and waste, combined with their insulation from environmental consequences, leads to resource depletion and environmental degradation that threatens the entire community's long-term viability. The short-term advantages that wealthy individuals gain through exploitation of others ultimately undermine the ecological foundation that sustains all community life. The artistic and cultural expressions that emerge from stratified communities reflect both celebration of elite privilege and resistance to unjust social arrangements. The elaborate decorative programs that adorn elite dwellings serve to legitimize and glorify social hierarchy,
while the folk traditions that develop among ordinary families preserve alternative values and maintain hope for more just social arrangements. These competing cultural narratives create rich artistic traditions that reflect the full complexity of human social experience. The demographic patterns that develop in response to systematic inequality reveal how social stratification affects basic biological processes, including fertility, mortality, and physical development. Elite families' superior nutrition and reduced physical stress allow them to maintain larger families and longer lifespans, while ordinary families experience higher infant mortality, reduced fertility, and shorter life expectancy that gradually alter the genetic composition of the entire community. These biological consequences of social inequality create additional barriers to social mobility and reinforce existing hierarchies.
The insights gained from this exploration of ancient crime and punishment remind us that the choices we make about how to organize our societies and respond to wrongdoing have consequences that extend far beyond immediate circumstances to shape the fundamental character of human civilization itself. The precedents established in these ancient settlements continue to echo through history, influencing how we understand the relationship between power and responsibility, the purposes of law and punishment, and the possibilities for creating truly just societies. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the shadows of ancient history, as the last embers of our imaginary fires dim in that settlement 7,000 years distant, we find ourselves returned to the comfort and safety of our modern world, carrying with us the wisdom and warnings of our earliest ancestors' struggles with justice, morality, and the delicate art of living together in organized society. The grain that passed from Enlil's storage jar to Aduk's desperate hands has long since returned to dust, yet the moral questions raised by that simple act of theft continue to resonate through every courthouse, every family discussion of right and wrong, every moment when we must choose between our individual desires and our collective responsibilities. The remarkable thing about our exploration of ancient justice is not how different these early communities were from our own, but how startlingly familiar their dilemmas remain. 7 millennia of technological advancement, philosophical development, and social evolution have not fundamentally altered the basic human challenges that confronted Kesh as she sat in judgment of Aduk's crime. The insights gained from this exploration of ancient crime and punishment remind us that the choices we make about how to organize our societies and respond to wrongdoing have consequences that extend far beyond immediate circumstances to shape the fundamental character of human civilization itself. The precedents established in these ancient settlements continue to echo through history, influencing how we understand the relationship between power and responsibility, the purposes of law and punishment, and the possibilities for creating truly just societies. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the shadows of ancient history, as the last embers of our imaginary fires dim in that settlement 7,000 years distant, we find ourselves returned to the comfort and safety of our modern world, carrying with us the wisdom and warnings of our earliest ancestors' struggles with justice, morality, and the delicate art of living together in organized society. The grain that passed from Enlil's storage jar to Aduk's desperate hands has long since returned to dust, yet the moral questions raised by that simple act of theft continue to resonate through every courthouse, every family discussion of right and wrong, every moment when we must choose between our individual desires and our collective responsibilities. The remarkable thing about our exploration of ancient justice is not how different these early communities were from our own, but how startlingly familiar their dilemmas remain. 7 millennia of technological advancement, philosophical development, and social evolution have not fundamentally altered the basic human challenges that confronted Kesh as she sat in judgment of Aduk's crime.
The children who appear throughout our narrative, from the innocent witnesses to Aduk's theft to the elite offspring whose moral development was distorted by extreme privilege, remind us that every decision about justice and social organization affects not only immediate participants, but future generations who will inherit the consequences of our choices. The patterns of behavior, the institutional structures, the moral precedents that we establish today will shape the world that our children and their children must navigate. This intergenerational perspective adds moral weight to decisions about justice that might seem to affect only contemporary circumstances. The community deliberation processes that we have observed in ancient settlements offer valuable models for contemporary efforts to create more participatory and democratic approaches to justice.
The careful consideration of multiple perspectives, the recognition that complex problems require community wisdom rather than individual authority, the understanding that lasting solutions must address root causes rather than merely punishing symptoms. These principles remain as relevant today as they were in Kesh's ancient settlement. The ancient emphasis on restoration rather than retribution, on healing community relationships rather than simply imposing punishment, provides inspiration for modern restorative justice programs that seek to address harm in ways that strengthen rather than fragment social bonds. The spiritual and ceremonial dimensions of ancient justice remind us that effective responses to wrongdoing must address not only practical consequences, but also symbolic meaning and emotional healing. The recognition that crime disrupts more than individual relationships, that it affects community harmony, spiritual balance, and cosmic order, suggests that purely secular approaches to justice may be incomplete.
While we may not share ancient beliefs about supernatural forces and divine justice, we can appreciate their understanding that wrongdoing creates wounds that require healing rituals and ceremonial recognition to be fully addressed. The trade networks and cultural exchanges that influenced ancient justice development remind us that no community exists in isolation, that local approaches to justice must be compatible with broader regional and international standards to be sustainable over time. The challenges that ancient communities faced when their local justice systems encountered different cultural traditions and legal frameworks parallel contemporary debates about international law, universal human rights, and the relationship between local autonomy and global standards. The technological innovations that emerged from ancient responses to crime and punishment illustrate how social challenges drive practical innovations that can have consequences far beyond their original purposes. The security measures, investigation techniques, and record-keeping systems developed to address ancient crimes established precedents for more sophisticated law enforcement and legal documentation that made possible the complex legal systems that characterize modern civilization. These technological developments remind us that innovations in justice and social control can be double-edged, providing tools for both protecting community welfare and oppressing vulnerable individuals. The grain that was stolen on that cold night 7,000 years ago has returned to the earth from which it came. But the moral questions raised by that simple act of desperation continue to nourish our understanding of justice, community, and human responsibility.
In the quiet of this moment, as we drift towards sleep, we can honor the memory of Abadduk, Enlil, Kesh, and all the unnamed individuals whose experiences shaped the foundations of civilization by committing ourselves to the ongoing work of creating more just and compassionate communities for future generations to inherit.